Welcome to the session. Let me figure out where we're at today. Today we're mostly going to be working on coloring in and finishing out some details on this page. This page was working on the trade district for this city over here, Coraline, or Coralin actually, which is the capital city of Tulia. We're in the world building sketchbook. And sometimes this is what things are like. Sometimes it's just the lovely methodical sitting down and actually coloring a thing and making it more beautiful and interesting. And so while I'm doing that today, I'm going to be talking about warriors. I'm going to be talking about some other things that come up, some questions that I've had in the last couple world building sessions. So I hope you'll grab a sketchbook and come along with me, and let's refocus the camera so we're a little bit closer in. I like to start on these things a lot of the time, especially when I'm not 100% sure where I'm going, by just adding in the grayscales. So I will often take one of my light grays and just start working in where I know some of the lighter shadows are going to be. Then I'll slowly work up towards some darker tones. This is a King Art twin tip or dual tip brush pen. I love these guys. My poor grays are my most used, and so they have a tendency to go out the fastest. And this poor guy has a tip that has seen better days. If you're doing similar things like this, working in brush pen or watercolor on top of your ink drawings, just make sure that they've sat long enough that they're totally dry. I usually like to give it 24 hours. I think that's a little bit of overkill. You could probably work quite a bit quicker. Why do I do this then? This is actually something that I get from working digitally, which is the fact that you can work in your black and whites and then set a multiply layer and start working on top of things, and only the colors will go over. The black and white, the value structure, will basically stay exactly the same. And, oh yeah, some of these trees are not done. That's fine. We can always do hatching over the top. So that's kind of where I got this strategy initially. And for brush pens, it works pretty well. You can do it with a lot of things. If I'm not mistaken, this might be what grisaille is, working and underpainting in grayscale. Getting your tones in, making sure your value structure is what you want it to be, and then going over the top. I do work on this on some of my miniatures. When I'm doing little miniature figurines and whatnot, I will often work underneath and make sure that the light structures are the way that I want them. This allows then you to just work over the top with your intended color, and assuming you've given it enough time to dry, the color just kind of goes over the top and you get a lot of the natural volumetric structure that you would look for. Your values will stay kind of consistent in there, which is really nice. So I had rather an interesting question last time on my last world building session, which was if there are warriors in my world. And I found this to be an interesting question because my initial reaction was almost like, well, of course, like it's fantasy. And then that was followed up by well, it's obviously not a silly question. It just, to me, that's a large reason why, a young teenage boy would get involved in creating something like that. Probably so many of us that are in the same boat as me fell in love with things like anime. And so it's like, yeah, like I want to create this world that has these awesome warriors. But that immediately started me thinking about why that is. So thank you to whoever asked that question. I'm sure you'll be here again and you can let me know in the comments below. And if you have questions too that you want me to ramble about and talk about in these world building sessions, I would love to hear it. I am not just an artist who does world building. I am also working on finishing out my second novel right now, and it's stuff that I am thinking about constantly. I am certainly not a professional writer, but I have a very contemplative mind. And even if I don't have an answer to what your question is, it might do us both some good to sit here and think about it for a while. So I started thinking about why that is, why warriors seem to be so natural in fantasy worlds and in world building scenarios. I think part of it is probably there's a level of fantasy, not meaning like a pun, but that as boys and as young men, which obviously that's, I'm a man, so that's the perspective I can more thoroughly talk from. We, play with swords and turn paper towel things into weapons, and that's a lot of our play as kids. We want to be warriors, we want to be soldiers. One of the most honorable professions for most of human history for a male has been war in some capacity, and there's a lot of opinions to be had about that and the honoring of that and what that really looks like. But there is this sense that if you are constructing a scenario that has kind of the ideal situation for a lot of people, it's a world where you can build up skills that allow you to fight evil, to do good things in the world. And that's kind of what we see in Star Wars. It's what we see in, Lord of the Rings, kind of, but not really. Most of the power that the hobbits display is just like good common sense, which, these days does feel a little bit more like a power. But there is something kind of nice about thinking that the world is, or existing in a world where you as a good person can develop skills that allow you to fight evil, to fight bad things, that there is something virtuous there. We as humans have a desire to, have some level of power, and I think that there is more of a justification in that if the power is employed in the service of good. And I'm not 100% sure. There's just this very natural desire and fantasy of being strong and having the ability to do cool wizardy things. And it's something that I've had in my life, my entire life. I don't necessarily walk around pretending to be an anime character anymore. Though, if I had a bad enough day, there's always a chance. But I spent a lot of my youth in that situation. I taught young kids for a long time, and a lot of them, when they started writing or, cosplaying or things like that, there was this element of, I want to be this warrior. I want to be powerful. I want to be strong enough to accomplish the things that I want. I also want to be strong enough that, my parents are proud of me. I want to be able to affect good, positive change in the world. And I think there might be something about that naturally pulls us into having warriors in these worlds that we build. Now, it's probably not quite that simple. There's probably something else to it. The idea of having power is obviously tantalizing, and there's a lot to be said about that in our world, about the idea of power and what power does to a person and the desire for power. But it seems to be ubiquitous in most of our mythological stories, in most of our religious texts, in most of the movies and things that have been huge over the last couple decades. There is pretty much always a sense of power. Sometimes the power is in proficiency. You see that with James Bond, where what we enjoy is watching somebody who is extremely proficient in what they're doing. But there's also just a lot of enjoying watching somebody who has an ability that is beyond ours. It's part of what we enjoy in reading sci-fi and fantasy, in reading most fiction, is we get to, for a moment, pretend or imbibe of these traits that other people have. And I think also there's just simply the rule of cool. It is a fun thing. It is interesting. I don't think any of us want to really exist in a world like Star Wars, where we are probably not force sensitive, and there are all these people in our world who have these amazing abilities and can lord them over us. But we like the idea of watching it happen. And some of us probably do wish we lived in those worlds. There's an escape element where we can escape our mundane and go into that kind of thing, and that's really enticing and really exciting. But yes, there are warriors in this world. There have to be. In fact, the stage of most of the novels is a big, large-scale war, though it doesn't quite start off in that way. Sorry if my voice sounds a little weird today. I am fighting off some sickness. I woke up with a sore throat this morning, so I will try my best to edit out any sick noises, but you're going to get bits and pieces of my voice because I can't necessarily edit all my voice out. That would make this quite boring. Or maybe for some of you it would be better, but just in case you get little sniffles or weirdness here and there, that's what it is. I'm not feeling particularly well, but here we are anyway. We're getting stuff done. So, but yeah, the backdrop for my story is essentially a big war, and it stems from mostly misunderstanding. I really enjoy big bad evils. I love Palpatine as a character. I love Sauron as a character. I really enjoy traditional bad guys. I know there's been a move in our society recently to have bad guys that are understandable, or we can wrap our heads around them. We can even identify with them. I get that, but I really enjoy the old school. But I find it interesting because the bad guy in my big novel is essentially miscommunication. Like, most of the issues that are happening in the world are happening due to fear, anxiety, xenophobia, things like that. People are fearing for their own freedoms, and so they are willing to take those freedoms away from others. And that's largely the landscape that has been built. And so there's a central, powerful empire that has largely kept to itself, but they have sent out tendrils into the world and have, unbeknownst to most of the masses of that country, have slowly built up this level of anxiety in all of the surrounding peoples. This leads to, at the end of the first book, an assault on this country. And for the average person who lives there, it just seems like the people of the plains charged in and attacked with no reason, no provocation. And so obviously that country is sitting there in a situation where they feel like, we've been attacked, this is totally unprovoked. And so it's easy then for the government to rile up the people, and they end up going down and occupying the lands of a lot of the other people groups. And basically the bad guy is the miscommunication, the anxiety, the fear. And I didn't intend that. When I first sat out to make this, I fully thought that I would just have like an evil bad guy, especially since I am not trying to say anything significant about, like everybody is redeemable or anything. It's like, no, I'm fine. I'm totally fine having bad guys that are just bad. I think that is part of how the world works. You don't run into a lot of evil people in your life, but I do believe that they exist. And I think that most, if not all, people are redeemable in some capacity. But, again, we're in a fantasy world. We don't have to tell things exactly how they are. Fantasy is often an extreme-ified version of things that gives us the ability as a group of people to analyze our world and understand more about it through the extremes. You look at the extreme racism and prejudice between elves and dwarves in Lord of the Rings, and that exists as a medium for us to discuss those things and talk about those things. And, it's this beautiful thing when you think about how Gimli and Legolas end up at the end of the story, when they are basically repairing and fixing thousands and thousands of years of damage between the races. And they don't start in a great spot, but they earn each other's respect. They are willing to work together, and you end up with this beautiful relationship coming out of it, and it's this wonderful thing. So that's kind of just a tiny little tidbit of the backdrop of the story, and what that means is that, yes, there are warriors, and I've tried through the story so far to make the warrior groups distinct, and this has started in simple ways, obviously, by like, what do they wear? You know, what kind of colored garb do these people have? What kind of weapons do they use? And I think that's the place you start. And then after that, you go into strategies. Like, are there specific strategies that these people use? Strategies that might be different than another group. And I've done a bit of that as well. You know, the main kind of antagonistic group have a lot more access to magic than most of the other peoples. So whereas everyone else is using, you know, this culture uses spears and shields, or swords and shields pretty predominantly, and this other one does a lot of fighting on horseback. This other race uses largely bows and works more covertly. Then you've got the antagonistic group that are using physical weapons, but their physical weapons are mostly as conduits for magical abilities. And it creates a difference in the way that those groups interact and how they fight, because, you know, it's a very different scenario if you are fighting with a sword and shield against someone who has the ability to summon fire with their sword. And so that's been kind of interesting to play out and to write. And I suppose on future edits and thinking about things going forward, I will start to really lean into, well, what happens when that's been the case for a while? Like, does, you know, by the end of the third novel, which it's supposed to be a trilogy, so that should be kind of just the end of that group of books altogether, will the other groups have responded by trying to teach more magic? Well, probably not, but maybe they'll have incorporated some magical technologies, because in the world I've constructed, magic is mostly meritocracy. It's like art, you know, go figure. Or like writing. It's a skill that is built, and most people have some natural level of aptitude. There are some people who are just like, that's not going to work for them. But for most people, they could develop the ability to have magic in some way, and most choose not to. As technology has progressed, there's just not a need. It is a ton of work. And it's actually something that's addressed very early on in the first novel, is they get to a city where the forges are used to, you know, make special kinds of glass and things by heating up materials and turning the sand and the silica into glass. And one of the people who does this is lamenting the fact that, like, there's no young people to teach anymore how to do this. Like, they don't want it. They don't want the skills. And it's a desert area, and there's actually a mage that is employed by the city in order to keep ice in a large underground area, so that they have a massive larder for the city. And there is constant worry because the mage is old and they can't find younger people who are willing to go and learn from this mage and take on the task, because they're able to get jobs elsewhere that pay better. And it's a lot of effort, and living out in the middle of the desert is not really what most people want to do, and they would probably have to hire somebody from a different country to do it. And so it's this interesting issue that I didn't anticipate. I would say most of what I've written so far is not stuff that I anticipated. They're just things that have kind of come up as I've been writing and trying to get myself into the heads of these people. And so it's a world where magic is accessible, and yet it requires a tremendous amount of effort. So there are not a lot of people in the current day who have it, and it's one of the deficits of the kind of the allied armies, with our protagonists working against this kind of old school empire. Is this is an isolated group of people who live in the mountains, and they have kept up. They have taught, as part of just their normal life for generations, they have taught how to use magic to their youth. And so most people that come from there have some ability. And as you might imagine, if you've got a culture that everyone is required to join the military for a time, everyone is taught specialized skills in their military time, and then you go against a country that, you know, has a standing military, yes, but, you know, doesn't require everyone to be a part of it, and has basically lesser technologies, that's a big deal. And so that's a lot of what's happening is, we outnumber them. It's like, but do you really? Like, you outnumber what you think. And the reality is, like, they're just far more equipped to do this than you are. And that's why kind of at the end of the first novel, like, things don't go well. Which I hope I'm not, like, giving things away. It will probably be a very long time, if the books are published. But yeah, it's interesting. So yes, warriors exist. I know I've spent how long now? What are we at? We're at like 21 minutes. So warriors exist in this world. They're very prominent. There's a lot of fights. I try to keep them pretty short, and I try to do lots of character development in them, because reading through a long fight sequence can kind of be pretty boring. And, I would love to hear from all of you, though, if there's any books that you have read that have like really well put together fight sequences, because a lot of the writing advice that you listen to or get is don't write out fight sequences. And I think there's a lot of logic to that. It's obviously going to have a propensity to be kind of boring to just do a blow by blow describing of how a fight goes. And so I try to keep them pretty brief. I did have at the end of the book I'm working on right now, there was a couple days where I had these long chapters, like 10,000 word chapters of the battle. But I figure at the end of the book, like, if you've stuck with me this far, you probably are okay with reading a little bit of this droning on, and finding out who lives, who dies, how things go. But the warriors, yeah, there's a lot of warriors. Every culture has them. They're kind of distinctly different. The area that I'm working on right now, this is Tulia, has its own warriors, one of whom ended up being a character that became a main character. And I did not intend that. At the beginning of the second book, I have a lot of my characters break up, and they're going on their own kind of individual journeys, their own individual purposes throughout the land. And I had a character from this country who ended up tagging along, and I did not intend that. That was not originally part of the plan. And so he ended up breaking his sword at one point, fighting some kind of weird eldritch thing in a swamp. And before they travel to this magical city, he ends up getting a new blade. And it's a blade that actually has an elemental stone embedded into it. And this gives it the ability to do elemental things. So this guy, his name's Garion, at this point, does not have any, natural magical ability on his own. But he gets a weapon that allows him to, with pretty minimal effort, channel elemental energies. And the stone that is embedded within it, which is semi-sentient, has the ability to absorb fire from the environment and then hold on to it. So he doesn't have to conjure the fire himself. He basically has a tool, a piece of technology that can hold on to the fire for him and then can expel it when he needs it. And it's been interesting writing about him learning how to do that, because it's not something that he had. He's learning basically a new piece of technology, and as he comes to learn the blades themselves, the weapons that have these abilities are often somewhat sentient. And so he's having to learn, like make a new friend in order to use this magical power. So it's been really intriguing working on that. And another thing that I did not plan when it comes to writing fights and working with my warriors is everybody gets hurt. A lot of the fantasy and sci-fi that I've read or watched, it seems like most of the time the good guys come out of every battle unscathed. And without planning for it, just naturally the way I was telling the stories, pretty much every conflict somebody gets hurt. And the more I thought about it over time, the more I'm like, yeah, that makes sense. Like, you are probably not going to come out of most conflicts without a scrape or a bruise of some kind. But I have characters who've lost like all the skin on their leg, or lost fingers, lost arms. Two of the characters that I was writing about last night, one lost an arm in a big conflict, and another lost an eye. And I have another character who her blade is a very, very powerful magical sword, but it was sundered at one point and it was broken. And so it is just like perpetually malfunctioning, and it leeches energy off of her, and she is in the process of dying because of that. And like, there are issues. Like, nobody escapes the combat unscathed. Everyone has, over time, sustained some level of injury from these things. And that is something I did not intend, but something that I'm very fond of as I write, because that's reality. You know, I have obviously not been in battle before, but I have raised a lot of animals. I've hunted. I've, done animal husbandry. I have, I live out in the country, and we have mountain lions and bears, and just in trying to do the work that is required around here to keep the property functional, going down and taking care of the sheep on a cold winter morning. We don't have them anymore, but we did for years. You get hurt. Like, and that's not battle. That's not war. That's just doing physical things, like jobs that require you to be outside every single, like, you just inevitably, like, I have so many scars in weird places from pieces of barbed wire or cattle panels catching. I've been charged by a ram and thrown off my feet into a backflip, involuntary backflip, very unpleasant, hurt a lot, by one of our big rams back in the day named Topaz. And, those are situations where I just know kind of instinctively from my own limited work with wildlife and rough and tumble things that injuries happen. And to me, it makes it more authentic. I don't think, I understand if you're telling a fantasy story and you want to create the scenario where your people are amazing and they don't get hurt, or it just doesn't augment the story you're telling. But for me, there's a grittiness and a reality to no, people get hurt. And sometimes characters die that you didn't expect them to die. I am certainly not going the George R.R. Martin route, but I tended that way with my first novel, and now the second as well, far more than I expected. I had a lot of ideas worked out, but all of a sudden I'll be in the middle of a conflict and be like, oh no, like, this is what needs to happen here. And I keep also introducing way too many characters. I did a count a while back on how many named characters I had, and it's nuts. It's something like 80 or 70 or whatever. Granted, they're not small books either. I have the first one, I think, was 260,000 words, and the second one is currently just under 200,000 words. For context, the Fellowship of the Ring is 154,000 words, and I think Harry Potter's like 87, the first Harry Potter book. So they are not small, and they might not be good, but they're good for me to write, good for me to get down, because they're things that have been sitting in my brain for so long. So it does me a lot of good to get them down. But yes, warriors exist in this world. I guess that's been most of the ramble here, right? And they're an integral part of things, but as I construct them, as I think about them in the world, I try to think about their culture, what kinds of things that's going to build up in them, what kind of people that's going to make them. I think about colors, I think about raiment, like what they're wearing. I think about the kinds of weapons they would use, how they would be forged. I think a lot about food and how they would transport food. Part of the reason that the antagonistic culture is so successful is because they have they live at high elevation. They have access to rice and lots of meats that allow them to be jerkied and therefore easily transported. And so when they travel, they can bring their food really easily with them. Their food transports well. It lasts for a long time. When anyone invades their home is at elevation. And so therefore it is, much harder for people who are not accustomed to that to live there and thrive there. And that's going to come up a lot in the third novel as kind of the assault on the Citadel occurs, because you get all these people that are from the plains that are living at like 1 or 2,000 feet above sea level, and all of a sudden they're assaulting over marsh and fen in an area that is 8,000 feet above sea level. That's hard. If you've ever been to a place like Colorado where we are at elevation, you understand that it is a lot harder to go for a hike. It is a lot harder to walk and exert yourself physically for long periods of time when you are 8,000 feet above sea level. Right now, as I'm sitting here working on this, I am at about 4,500 feet above sea level. That's where we live. Something we don't think about much because obviously, like, if that's what you live in, why would you think about it? But when I go to sea level, I'm always surprised, like, oh, I could run for way longer than normal because it's just easier. So, but yeah, those are the things I would think about when you're constructing warriors for your world. I would think about where they come from. I would think about what drives them. I would think about the unique factors that make up their culture and how those things are going to impact their combat, how things are going to impact their weaponry, and if you use magic in your world, try to think about how that's integrated. The fact that in mine it's essentially something that is earned via skill gives me the ability to say, like, this person is better predominantly because they have worked harder. And in the same way that art works, there are some people who are just born with a higher propensity and they've also refined those skills. And then you've got, savants, people that are just exceedingly gifted. And it's not fair, but those people are just extremely skilled, and that's what it is. And the other side is that, what's the toll that magic takes if you're going to have magic in your world? And in mine, it's basically a physical resource. I suppose at a fundamental level, it's similar to how things are done in Avatar: The Last Airbender, except that in that, which is a lovely, awesome show, but a kid's show, you never really see people get to a point where, like, they're at death's door because they're using their magic too much. You do get some points where people kind of get exhausted, but even that's very rare. And so in my world, it's essentially, it uses an additional system, like circulatory or nervous system, to handle it. And if you deplete that, like, the same thing happens as would happen if you depleted your physical energy. If you worked way too hard, like, you would get to the point where you would pass out, where you might lose consciousness. And if you push it too far, just like if you run a horse for too long, terrible things can happen. And so people can die from overusing their magical energies. And it's not like oh, dang, I went too far, I'm now toast. It's, like, you would feel it. You would be getting exhausted. You would be making that choice in that moment. Like, I am going to continue using my magical ability here to, like, help other people escape. And I am just aware that this is probably going to kill me. So, yeah, that's the way I think about it. Gonna probably go ahead and wrap this up here pretty quick. We are getting at a good amount of time. We've gotten a lot of the coloring done here. It's looking pretty cool. I love these brush pens. They are so much fun to work with. So, well, I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you got something out of it. I would love to hear your comments and questions. The last two of these sessions have been primarily responding to questions. So please, if you have any, let me know, and I will ramble about those in the next one. If they fit broadly where I'm at and what I'm doing, and if not, I'll probably still address them. So I would really appreciate that. Thank you to my patrons who are on the screen right now. They help keep this kind of stuff going. If you want to check out the Patreon, feel free to do so. It's linked below. It gives you access to some videos that are exclusive there, as well as the ability to vote and direct upcoming content. And we have a Discord server as well. I would encourage you to check that out. Well, have a good one, y'all. See you soon.